Picture this. You are Sultan Sanjar, the most powerful ruler in the Islamic world, waking up inside a bedchamber guarded by 1,000 elite soldiers. You sweep aside your silk sheets, and your hand hits cold steel. A silver dagger stands upright in the floorboards, pinned exactly 4 inches from your throat. No guards heard a footstep. No doors were forced. A scrap of parchment rests under the hilt with a message that makes your blood run cold. Had we not wished the Sultan well, the dagger would have been in his heart, not the floor. This moment of absolute vulnerability in a room of gold marks a terrifying shift in the history of power. While the world focused on grand crusades and massive sieges, the secret court chronicles of the Seljuks whisper of a shadow state that operated by a different set of rules. This was the calling card of the Order of Assassins. They didn't need an army to conquer a kingdom. They only needed the psychological paralysis of a single well-placed blade. How did a tiny cult of mountain outcasts manage to hold the greatest empires of the medieval age hostage without ever winning a single open battle? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Seljuk Empire dominated the 11th century with a military machine that crushed everything in its path. Their heavy cavalry turned the plains of Persia and Anatolia into a graveyard for their enemies. They built grand universities and mosques to cement their Sunni orthodoxy. They functioned as a superpower, believing that sheer numbers and ironclad walls ensured their survival. Hassan-i Sabbah watched this empire from the fringes. He was a brilliant polymath, a man who measured the stars and calculated the movements of planets, but his real interest lay in the mechanics of fear. Hassan knew his people, the Ismaili Shia, could never survive a head-on collision with the Seljuk war machine. He needed a fortress that defied the logic of the plains. He found it in the Alborz Mountains. A jagged ridge of rock called Alamut says all the eagle's teaching. Instead of an army, Hassan sent missionaries into the castle's garrison. They didn't carry swords, they carried ideas. Slowly the guards began to look to Hassan for leadership rather than the governor. When Hassan finally walked through the gates, the fortress had already surrendered from within. He paid the former governor 3,000 gold dinars and took the keys. Without a single arrow fired, the order had its headquarters. Hassan-i Sabbah transformed this mountain peak into a laboratory for a new kind of warfare. He recruited men who had lost everything to the Seljuk expansion. He trained them to blend into the background, to learn languages, and to wait for months for the perfect moment. These men were called the Fedai, those who sacrificed themselves. The first target changed the political landscape forever. Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier and the brain of the Seljuk Empire, was travelling to the royal harem. A man dressed as a Sufi mystic stepped out of the crowd. He didn't run. He didn't hide his weapon. He walked directly to the vizier's litter and drove a knife into his heart. The assassin stood his ground, waiting to be cut down by the guards, a smile of calm satisfaction on his face. This public execution sent a shockwave through the ruling elite. Walls no longer felt solid. Bodyguards no longer felt loyal. The assassins had proven that no one was out of reach. They turned the very infrastructure of the empire against itself. They used the Sultan's own palaces and mosques as the stage for their theatre of terror. As the Seljuks scrambled to respond, they realized the enemy had no front lines to attack. You couldn't defeat them with cavalry charges. Every time the Seljuks executed a suspected assassin, they created a new martyr and a dozen more recruits. The mountain cult had cracked the code of asymmetrical warfare, turning their small numbers into an advantage that paralyzed 3 empires. The silver dagger on Sultan Sanjar's floor was more than a threat. It was proof that the old world of kings and armies was over, and the era of the shadow had begun. Before he was the most feared man in the East, Hassan-i Sabbah was a boy with a library. He grew up in the city of Rai, a bustling hub of trade and intellect near modern-day Tehran. His father was a strict scholar, and young Hassan spent his childhood devouring every text he could find on geometry, astronomy, and law. He didn't set out to be a revolutionary, He set out to be a master of the universe through the power of his own mind. In his early years, he followed the mainstream Sunni path, the very ideology he would later spend his life trying to dismantle. But Ray was a crossroads of dangerous ideas. One day, Hassan encountered a preacher of the Ismaili faith. At first, the young scholar laughed off the man's arguments. He was confident in his logic. However, the more they debated, the more Hassan realized that his traditional education had left a void in his understanding of the divine. A severe illness nearly took his life shortly after, and in the fever of his recovery, he made a vow. If he survived, he would dedicate himself to the Ismaili cause. He didn't just join a religion, he joined a struggle for the soul of the Islamic world. Hassan-i Sabbah travelled to Cairo, the heart of the Fatimid Caliphate, to complete his training. This was the 11th century equivalent of moving from a provincial town to New York City. Cairo was a shimmering metropolis of white marble and intellectual fire. Hassan studied at the House of Wisdom, one of the greatest centres of learning in history. He honed his skills in linguistics, mathematics, and the art of the dawah, the missionary call. But he also saw the rot behind the gold leaf. The Fatimid leadership was weak, distracted by internal squabbles and the rising power of their generals. A clash with the powerful military commander Badr al-Jamali forced Hassan into exile. He was thrown onto a ship and sent away, narrowly surviving a shipwreck in the Mediterranean. He didn't see this as a failure. He saw it as a sign. He began a wandering journey across the deserts and mountains of Persia that would last nearly a decade. During these years, he lived as a ghost. He moved from village to village, disguised as a common traveller or a humble teacher, all while building a secret network of followers. He wasn't just preaching, he was scouting. He was looking for a crack in the Seljuk armour. His eyes eventually turned toward the Alborz mountains. Most military leaders saw these peaks as a logistical nightmare, a place where supply lines died and armies froze. Hassan saw a sanctuary. He identified Alamut Castle as the perfect site for his grand experiment. The fortress sat on a narrow ridge that rose nearly 7,000 feet above sea level. Access was limited to a single winding path that could be defended by 2 men against 100. The takeover of Alamut is a masterclass in slow-burn subversion. Hassan didn't charge the gates with a sword. Instead, he sent his most charismatic followers into the surrounding valleys. They helped the locals with their harvests. They taught the children. They slowly convinced the people that the Seljuk governor of the castle was a foreign oppressor. Then, his missionaries started working on the garrison itself. They didn't offer bribes, they offered a sense of purpose. By the year 1090, the governor of Alamut realized he was a prisoner in his own home. Every guard who stood at his door, every servant who brought him food, had secretly pledged their life to the scholar living in the shadows of the nearby village. When Hassan-i Sabbah finally walked up the mountain path and entered the gates, he didn't need a weapon. He simply sat down and told the governor that the castle no longer belonged to him. The governor tried to resist, but he realized his men wouldn't lift a finger to help him. Hassan allowed the man to leave with a massive payment of 3,000 gold dinars, a gesture that proved he was a man of his word even to his enemies. From the moment he stepped into Alamut, Hassan never left the fortress for the remaining 35 years of his life. He lived in a small room filled with scrolls and maps. He directed a global network of agents from a wooden desk. He established a code of conduct so strict that he even executed his own sons for minor infractions, to prove that no one was above the law of the order. He turned a pile of stones on a mountain into a sovereign state that had no borders, no taxes, and no army, yet held the fate of kings in its hands. Under his leadership, Alamut became more than a fort. It became a university of the forbidden. While the rest of the world was descending into the chaos of the First Crusade, the residents of Alamut were studying the stars and refining the art of the hidden blade. Hassan-i Sabbah had realized that true power doesn't come from holding land, it comes from holding the minds of those who walk upon it. He had built a machine of pure will, and he was finally ready to turn the key. The most enduring image of the assassins comes from the travelogues of Marco Polo, written nearly a century after the fortress of Alamut had already fallen to ruin. He describes a secret valley hidden between 2 mountains, filled with the most delicious fruits, gilded pavilions, and runnels flowing with wine, milk, and honey. In this garden, beautiful women sang and danced for the young recruits, convincing them they had literally stepped into paradise. According to the legend, Hassan-i Sabbah would drug these young men with a mysterious substance, carry them into this garden while they slept, and then pluck them back out into the harsh reality of the fortress. He told them that if they died in his service, they would return to this heaven forever. It is a cinematic story, a perfect explanation for why a man would throw himself onto a guard's spear just to deliver a killing blow. There is only one problem. The story is almost certainly a lie. Marco Polo never set foot in Alamut. He gathered his information from campfire gossip and the fearful whispers of enemies who wanted to paint the Nizari Ismailis as nothing more than brainwashed drug addicts. The very name Hashishin, from which we get the word assassin, was likely a slur. In the medieval Middle East, calling someone a hashishita was the equivalent of calling them low class or socially irrelevant. It wasn't a description of their diet. It was an insult directed at their perceived status as outcasts. The reality of how Hassan-i Sabbah hacked the human mind is far more sophisticated and far more terrifying than a simple drug-induced hallucination. To understand the true power of the order, we have to look past the myths of Marco Polo and into the chemistry of the human brain. Chroniclers of the time mention the use of potions and herbs, but modern neurobiological analysis suggests they weren't using cannabis. Hashish is a sedative. It makes a person sluggish, uncoordinated, and prone to paranoia. A man high on hashish is the last person you would trust to navigate a high-security palace and strike a moving target with surgical precision. Instead, historical evidence suggests the use of alkaloids found in plants like Hyoscyamus niger or datura. In specific controlled doses, these substances don't just cause hallucinations, they induce a state of lucid dreaming or hypnagogia. The recruit remains physically capable, but enters a state where the line between reality and suggestion completely dissolves. Hassan-i Sabbah wasn't just a theologian, he was an early master of sensory deprivation and psychological conditioning. The training began with isolation. A recruit would spend weeks in a dark, silent room, stripped of the sensory input that usually anchors a person to their identity. During this time, they were fed a diet of intense religious instruction, focusing on the absolute authority of the Imam. When the brain is starved of a light and sound, it becomes desperate for meaning. It becomes highly suggestible. At the peak of this mental fragility, the potion was administered. The recruit didn't wake up in a physical garden. They experienced a chemical-induced vision that felt more real than the stone wall surrounding them. Because the vision was guided by the words of their masters, it reinforced the ideology they had been fed during their weeks of isolation. This wasn't simple brainwashing. It was the weaponization of the subconscious. By the time the recruit woke up, he didn't just believe in the cause, he had seen the reward. He possessed a physiological certainty that death was merely a doorway to a state he had already tasted. This is what made the Fidai so dangerous. You can't bribe a man who has seen paradise. You can't threaten a man who views his own body as a temporary vessel. The discipline inside Alamut was equally rigorous. While the myths speak of wine and debauchery, the historical record shows a community that followed the strictest code of conduct in the region. Hassan-i Sabbah banned music and wine within the fortress walls. He reportedly executed one of his own sons just for the suspicion of drinking alcohol. The life of an assassin was one of asceticism, constant study, and relentless physical training. They learned to speak foreign dialects, to study the social customs of their enemies, and to blend into a royal court or a crowded market without drawing a single glance. This level of preparation required a clear mind, not one clouded by narcotics. The paradise they fought for wasn't a drug-fueled dream. It was a political and spiritual vision of a world where their persecuted faith could finally stand tall. They weren't assassins in their own eyes. They were the Nizari Ismailis, the defenders of the true line of the Prophet. To the empires surrounding them, they were a terrifying enigma. To themselves, they were the only ones who truly knew the truth. Hassan-i Sabbah had built something the world had never seen, a school for the perfect soldier. He realized that a single man with a sharp mind and a controlled heart was worth more than 1,000 mercenaries. The Seljuk sultans were looking for an army to fight, but Hassan had given them a ghost they couldn't touch. He had decoded the chemistry of devotion, and now he was ready to use it to reshape the map of the world. The air inside the great mosque of Isfahan hung thick with the scent of ambergris and the rhythmic chanting of thousands of worshippers. It was a Friday in the year 1092, the most sacred day of the week, in the most public space of the Seljuk capital. Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier, and the true architect of the empire's stability, walked through the parting crowd. He was a man of nearly 80, draped in the heavy robes of his office, surrounded by a phalanx of elite guards. He felt untouchable, shielded by the sanctity of the mosque and the sheer weight of his own authority. A young man, dressed in the tattered wool of a Sufi mystic, stepped out from behind a pillar. He looked like any other beggar seeking a blessing or a coin. He moved with a quiet, humble shuffle that didn't trigger a single alarm in the minds of the veteran bodyguards. As the vizier passed, the mystic reached into his sleeve. He didn't pull out a bowl for alms. He drew a long, slender blade. Before the guards could even register the movement, the knife had found the gap in the vizier's armour. The strike was surgical, driven by a hand that did not shake. The mosque erupted into chaos. The guards swarmed the attacker, their swords rising and falling in a frantic attempt to reclaim the control they had just lost. But the young man made no effort to parry. He didn't try to vanish into the screaming crowd. He stood over the dying vizier, his eyes calm, almost radiant as the blades tore through his own flesh. He died within seconds of his target. This was the moment the world learned the term propaganda by the deed. Hassan-i Sabbah had realized that a killing in the dark is a private tragedy, but a killing in the light is a political earthquake. The Order of Assassins rejected the quiet efficiency of poison or the accidental nature of a fall from a horse. They wanted witnesses. They needed the public to see the blood on the mosque floor and the serene face of the killer who embraced his own execution. By choosing the most crowded places and the most sacred times, they turned the very infrastructure of society into a weapon against the ruling elite. They proved that no amount of military might could protect a man if his enemy was willing to pay for his death with their own soul. The death of Nizam al-Mulk did more than remove a brilliant administrator. It shattered the internal logic of the Seljuk state. Within weeks, the Sultan himself was dead under suspicious circumstances. The empire, which had seemed like a monolithic wall of iron, suddenly fractured into a dozen competing factions. Princes turned on their brothers, and generals scrambled to grab whatever territory they could hold. The assassins didn't need to conquer Isfahan or Baghdad. They simply removed the person who held the pieces together and watched the entire machine vibrate itself to pieces. This was the ultimate form of asymmetrical warfare. The Seljuks were built for massive traditional campaigns. They understood how to lay siege to a city for months, how to deploy thousands of horse archers on an open plain, and how to manage vast supply lines. They were completely unprepared for an enemy that operated on the scale of a single human heart. You cannot launch a counterattack against a ghost. You cannot retaliate against a man who is already dead. The psychological fallout was even more devastating than the political vacuum. Every high-ranking official in the Islamic world began to look at their own servants with suspicion. Rumours spread that the assassins had infiltrated every level of the government. Was the man pouring the Sultan's wine a secret convert? Was the scribe writing the military orders a sleeper agent for Alamut? Paranoia became the defining characteristic of the medieval court. Powerful men began wearing chainmail shirts under their silken tunics, even when they went to bed. They stopped appearing in public. They built walls within walls, effectively imprisoning themselves in an attempt to stay safe. Hassan-i Sabbah sat in his library in the clouds and watched the ripples of his work. He had perfected a system where the fear of an attack was more effective than the attack itself. He didn't have to kill every general in the Seljuk army. He only had to make every general believe that he could. The order had successfully hacked the social contract of the era. They showed that the vertical hierarchy of kings and subjects was incredibly fragile when confronted by a horizontal network of believers who shared a single, unshakable purpose. As the Seljuk Empire began to bleed out from 1,000 internal cuts, the assassins expanded their reach. They seized more mountain fortresses, creating a jagged constellation of power that stretched from the borders of modern-day Afghanistan to the shores of the Mediterranean. They had become a state without a map, a government that existed in the spaces between empires. The propaganda by the deed had worked. The world now knew that there was a power in the mountains that didn't answer to any king, and that the price of ignoring them was a silver blade in the heart of the capital. By the middle of the 12th century, the terror of the assassins had migrated west, crossing the deserts of Iraq into the rugged limestone hills of Syria. While the original masters in Alamut remained the ideological heart of the movement, a new figure emerged who would become the face of the order for the Western world. His name was Rashid ad-Din Sinan, but to the Crusaders and the local sultans, he was known by a title that whispered of ancient untouchable power, the Old Man of the Mountain. Sinan didn't just inherit a franchise of killers, he built a shadow kingdom that played the great powers of the Levant against each other with the precision of a master chess player. The most formidable opponent Sinan ever faced was not a Crusader king, but the legendary Saladin, the man who would eventually recapture Jerusalem for Islam. Saladin was a master of conventional war, a leader of immense charisma and military genius who aimed to unify the Muslim world under his own banner. To Saladin, the assassins were a dangerous heresy that threatened his vision of a unified front. He decided to do what the Seljuks had failed to do. He would march into the heart of their territory and wipe them out. In 1176, and Saladin's massive army carved a path through the Syrian countryside and laid siege to Masyaf, the headquarters of the Syrian assassins. Saladin was a cautious man. He had already survived 2 assassination attempts by Sinan's men, and he took no chances. He cleared the brush around his tent so no one could hide. He strewed fine chalk and sand around his bed to catch the footprints of any intruder. He slept in a specially constructed wooden tower within his own camp, surrounded by his most loyal guards. He was a lion in a cage of iron. One morning Saladin woke up and found that the iron cage had been breached. Beside his bed lay a platter of hot, fresh cakes, a local specialty known as kauk, the kind his own mother used to make. Next to the cakes was a poisoned dagger and a note written in Sinan's own hand. The message was simple: "You are within our reach." The chalk on the floor was undisturbed. The guards outside had seen nothing. The cakes were still warm, as if they had just been pulled from an oven in a kitchen miles away. Saladin, the man who would later defy the combined might of Europe's kings, realized he was fighting an enemy that didn't play by the rules of physics. He didn't just lift the siege, he sought a permanent truce. The great Sultan understood that while he could conquer cities, he could not conquer a shadow that could walk through walls and bake cakes in the middle of a war zone. From that day forward, Saladin and the Old Man of the Mountain maintained a bizarre, secret alliance. The assassins stopped targeting Saladin's commanders, and in return, Saladin allowed their mountain fortresses to exist as an independent state within his empire. Rashid ad-Din Sinan was a master of this kind of theatrical diplomacy. He understood that his power didn't come from the number of soldiers he commanded, but from the legends people told about him. Stories spread through the Crusader camps that Sinan's men could leap from the highest towers of Masyaf at his command, plummeting to their deaths just to prove their loyalty to a visiting diplomat. European knights, used to the clear-cut hierarchies of feudalism, were terrified by this level of devotion. They began to believe that the Old Man of the Mountain possessed supernatural powers, that he could read minds and control the very wind that blew through the mountain passes. Sinan leaned into these myths. He rarely appeared in public, and when he did, he was draped in veils and surrounded by an aura of absolute silence. He turned his small territory in the Syrian mountains into a diplomatic grey zone. He would offer his services to the Crusaders when it suited his interest to weaken a local rival, and then he would turn back to the Muslim princes when the Crusaders grew too powerful. He was the ultimate wild card in the bloody deck of the Crusades. This period marked the transformation of the order from a purely religious movement into a sophisticated political entity. Under Sinan, the assassins became the ultimate power brokers of the Middle East. They didn't seek to rule the world. They sought to ensure that no one else could rule it completely. By maintaining a balance of terror, they ensured their own survival in a landscape of giants. The Old Man of the Mountain had proven that in a world of kings and empires, the most dangerous man is the one who rules the space between them. When the first waves of European knights arrived in the Holy Land, they were prepared to fight an army of flesh and steel. They understood the charge of heavy cavalry and the slow grind of a castle siege. What they were not prepared for was an enemy that didn't wear a uniform, didn't march under a banner, and didn't seem to fear death. To the Frankish Crusaders, the Nizari Ismailis were a terrifying mystery, a shadowy brotherhood they called the Assassini. The Europeans didn't care about the complex theology of the Shia-Sunni rift. They only saw a group of mountain dwellers who could reach into the most secure Christian strongholds and pluck the life from a king as easily as a peasant. The relationship between the Order and the Crusader military orders, like the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, was a dark mirror of medieval politics. On the surface, they were mortal enemies, religious fanatics on opposite sides of a holy war. In reality, they were often reluctant business partners. The assassins' Syrian fortresses were surrounded by Crusader territory, leading to a strange system of tributes and protection rackets. At one point, the assassins actually paid an annual tax of 2,000 gold pieces to the Templars to ensure their supply lines remained open. It was a cold, pragmatic arrangement, where gold bought a fragile peace between two of the most disciplined organizations in history. This peace shattered on April 28, 1192, in the city of Tyre. The victim was Conrad of Montferrat. He was the man who had just been elected King of Jerusalem. Conrad was a formidable warrior and a savvy politician, but he made a fatal mistake. He offended the Old Man of the Mountain by seizing a ship belonging to the Order and refusing to return the cargo. Rashid ad-Din Sinan didn't send an army to Tyre. He sent 2 young men. These 2 Fada'i didn't just sneak into the city, they lived there for 6 months. They disguised themselves as Christian monks, attending daily mass and learning the local dialect until they were a seamless part of the city's fabric. They waited with the patience of predators. On a quiet evening, as Conrad was walking home from dinner at the house of the Bishop of Beauvais, the 2 monks approached him. They knelt as if to receive a blessing, and then they struck. Conrad was stabbed multiple times in the side and chest. He died before he could reach his palace. The assassination of the King of Jerusalem sent a shockwave across Europe. It was the first time a Western monarch had fallen to the Order, and it sparked one of the greatest conspiracy theories of the Middle Ages. Conrad's primary rival was King Richard the Lionheart of England. Richard was known for his legendary temper and his desire for absolute control over the Crusader states. Many contemporary chroniclers accused Richard of hiring the assassins to remove his political opponent. While Richard vehemently denied the charges, the suspicion lingered for centuries. The Order had achieved something remarkable. They had become the ultimate weapon in the internal power struggles of the Western world. They were no longer just a religious sect, and they were a geopolitical force that could tip the scales of history with a single strike. The Europeans were fascinated and horrified by the psychological mechanics of the Order. They struggled to understand why an assassin wouldn't try to escape after the deed. To a Western knight, the goal of a raid was to survive and win glory. To a Fadari, the goal was the completion of the mission, and the subsequent execution was seen as a promotion to a higher plane of existence. This fundamental difference in the value of human life made the assassins the most effective intelligence and strike force in the Levant. By the end of the Third Crusade, the term assassin had officially entered the European lexicon. It travelled back to the courts of Paris, London and Rome, shedding its specific religious meaning and becoming a general term for a professional politically motivated killer. The myths of the Order began to grow, fueled by the tall tales of returning soldiers. They spoke of a secret society that controlled the world from a hidden valley, a narrative that would eventually inspire everything from Renaissance literature to modern video games. For the Order of Assassins, the Crusader era was their golden age of international influence. They had proven that they could operate across cultural and linguistic barriers. They had neutralized sultans, terrified viziers, and now they had changed the line of succession for the throne of Jerusalem. However, while they were busy playing the kings and knights of the West against each other, a new storm was brewing in the East. A power was rising on the steppes of Central Asia that didn't care about theology, didn't fear daggers on pillows, and didn't negotiate with ghosts. The era of the shadow was about to meet the era of the Iron Tide. While the kings of Europe and the sultans of the East saw Alamut as a dark hive of murderers, a very different reality existed behind the fortress's limestone walls. If you had been a scholar in the early 13th century, fleeing the chaos of crumbling dynasties or the early tremors of the Mongol advance, Alamut wouldn't have looked like a den of terrorists. It would have looked like the most sophisticated university on the planet. Hassan-i Sabbah had left behind a directive that his successors followed with fanatical devotion: the collection and preservation of human knowledge. He believed that to rule the shadows, one must first understand the light of reason. The heart of this mountain state was its library. In an era where books were hand-copied treasures and most were lost to war or neglect, the library at Alamut was a miracle of the medieval world. It housed tens of thousands of volumes, ranging from Greek philosophy and Indian mathematics to Persian poetry and secret alchemical texts. Scholars from across the Islamic world, regardless of their specific sect or belief, were invited to live within the fortress walls. They were given housing, food, and most importantly the silence needed to think. The air in the upper reaches of the castle didn't smell of blood or poison. It smelled of old parchment, expensive inks, and the cold, thin air of the stars. The most famous of these residents was Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, one of the greatest polymaths in history. To the outside world, he was a captive of the assassins, but the records suggest a more complex relationship. Inside the safety of the mountain forts, Tusi was given the resources to build a world-class observatory. He spent years calculating the movements of the planets and refining the mathematics that would, centuries later, provide the foundation for Copernicus and the European Renaissance. There is a deep historical irony here. The very men who were sending killers to strike down the leaders of the age were simultaneously funding the scientific breakthroughs that would define the future of humanity. Life inside the assassin state was governed by a relentless, almost monastic discipline. Unlike the decadent courts of Baghdad or Cairo, the leaders of Alamut lived ascetic lives. They focused on self-sufficiency, building complex irrigation systems that turned the dry mountain slopes into terraced gardens of fruit and grain. They were masters of water engineering, carving deep cisterns into the solid rock that could hold enough water to sustain the population through years of siege. They had created a sustainable intellectual utopia that existed entirely outside the traditional feudal system. They didn't rely on peasants to till their fields. They were a community of equals, bound by a shared ideological and scientific purpose. However, this focus on intellectual pursuit and administrative stability brought a new kind of danger. As the decades passed, the revolutionary fire that had fueled Hassan-i Sabbah began to cool into the embers of a bureaucratic state. The leaders who followed the legendary old men of the mountain grew more interested in the comforts of their libraries and the preservation of their mountain estates than in the dangerous game of international assassination. They began to act more like traditional lords, engaging in complex tax disputes and minor border skirmishes with neighbouring governors. The edge of the blade was beginning to dull. The radicalism of the early years was also softened by a series of strange theological shifts. At one point, a leader named Hassan II declared the resurrection, a spiritual event where the external laws of Islam were abolished in favour of a purely internal, mystical connection to the divine. He famously broke the fast of Ramadan in a public feast, signalling a move away from the strict militant orthodoxy of the past. And while this led to a flourishing of mystical poetry and philosophy, it also alienated the more conservative elements of the movement and weakened the singular, iron-willed focus that had made the order so terrifying to its enemies. The assassins had become a state of scholars, but they were a state without a standing army. They still relied on their reputation for terror to keep the world at bay, but that reputation was based on deeds that were becoming increasingly distant memories. They had built a beautiful, fragile sanctuary in the clouds, filling it with the greatest minds and the rarest books of the age. They believed that their walls and their wisdom would protect them forever. They were wrong. Far to the east, beyond the Oxus River, a force had emerged that had no respect for libraries and no fear of secret daggers. The Mongols, led by the descendants of Genghis Khan, were moving across the earth like a geological event. They didn't care about the theological nuances of the Ismaili faith or the scientific genius of Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. They saw the mountain fortresses not as centres of learning, but as obstacles to be flattened. The era of the scholar was about to be ended by the era of the siege engine, and for the first time in 2 centuries the shadows of Alamut had nowhere left to hide. For nearly 2 centuries, the Order of Assassins had lived by a simple, terrifying rule. A single man with a blade could hold an empire hostage. They had mastered the art of the precision strike, the psychological trauma that paralyzed kings and sultans. But in the year 1253, the rules of the game didn't just change. The board was set on fire. A messenger arrived at the gates of Alamut with news that turned the thin mountain air cold. The Mongols were coming. Not as a raiding party or a diplomatic mission, but as a systematic force of erasure. Leading them was Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, and he carried a specific mandate from the great Khan in Karakoram. The Order of Assassins must cease to exist. Every fortress must be levelled. Every library must be burned. Every follower of the Old Man of the Mountain must be hunted until the very name was forgotten by history. The Mongols represented a threat the assassins were fundamentally unprepared for. In the past, the order had survived by targeting individuals. If a Seljuk vizier grew too aggressive, they killed him. If a Crusader king threatened their borders, they removed him. But the Mongol Empire was not a collection of individuals. It was a collective machine. It was a tidal wave of iron and horseflesh that didn't rely on a single brain to function. You could kill a Mongol general, and another would take his place by sunset, equally cold and equally committed to the mission. The dagger on the pillow was a psychological weapon, but the Mongols were immune to psychology. They didn't fear death because they were the harbingers of it. Hulagu Khan brought with him a military technology that made the unconquerable walls of the Albaz Mountains look like sandcastles. He didn't just bring horse archers, he brought thousands of Chinese engineers who specialized in the science of the siege. They carried massive traction trebuchets, and capable of hurling boulders and incendiary pots over distances previously thought impossible. They built roads where there were only goat paths. They redirected rivers. The Mongols were not interested in a fair fight or a glorious duel. They were interested in the total removal of obstacles. The assassins tried to use their old tricks. They sent teams of Fadari to infiltrate the Mongol camp, aiming for Hulagu himself. But the Mongols operated with a level of security that made the Seljuk palaces look like open markets. Their camps were structured in rigid, concentric circles of loyal tribesmen. Anyone who didn't belong was spotted instantly. The few assassins who managed to get close were not just killed, they were dismantled as a warning. For the first time in their history, the Order realized that their greatest weapon, the willingness to die, meant nothing to an enemy that was perfectly happy to oblige them. As the Mongol army moved through the Persian heartland, they employed a strategy of submit or vanish. They would arrive at a city, offer terms, and if those terms were refused, they would kill every living thing inside, down to the cats and dogs, and pile the skulls into pyramids. This wasn't mindless cruelty. It was a cold, calculated form of communication. By the time they reached the foothills of the Alborz, the psychological advantage had flipped. It was the assassins who were now paralyzed by fear. The mountain people, who for generations had looked to Alamut for protection, began to realize that their masters were just as vulnerable as anyone else. The Grand Master of the Assassins at the time was a young man named Rukn al-Din Khusha. He had inherited a state that was intellectually brilliant but militarily stagnant. He tried to play the old game of diplomacy, sending messengers to Hulagu with hollow promises of loyalty and requests for more time. Hulagu, a man of few words and zero patience, sent back a simple demand. Dismantle your fortresses and present yourself in person, or watch the sky fall. Khusha hesitated. He looked at the massive libraries of Alamut, the scientific instruments of Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, and the thousands of families living in the shadow of the peaks. He hoped that the rugged terrain would defeat the Mongols as it had defeated everyone else. He was wrong. The Mongols didn't fight the mountains, they engineered them. They spent months building massive ramps of earth and stone to bring their heavy artillery within range of the castle walls. They used 1,000-man crossbows that could fire bolts through solid rock. The Mongol siege of Alamut was not a battle of courage, it was a battle of physics. The assassins watched from their high towers as the Mongol machine slowly, methodically, and inevitably closed the distance. The shadows that had ruled the east for 200 years were finally being dragged into the blinding, pitiless light of the Mongol sun. By December 1256, The Elburz Mountains were locked in a skeletal grip of ice and snow. Inside the high walls of Alamut, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool, dying fires, and the quiet, suffocating realization that the world of the assassins was ending. Below the fortress, the Mongol encampment stretched across the valley like a sea of felt tents and iron. Hulagu Khan was not a patient man. He had spent months watching his engineers grind the mountain's defences into dust. He didn't want a heroic last stand. He wanted a total surrender. He sent a final ultimatum to Rukn al-Din Kersha, the last Grand Master of the Order. Come down from your nest, or we will turn the mountain itself into your tomb. Rukn al-Din, a young man who had spent more time with scrolls than swords, looked at his options and found none. His followers were exhausted. The legendary secret passages were being mapped by Mongol spies. Even the divine protection of the Imam seemed to have vanished in the face of Mongol steel. On November 19th, 1256, the unthinkable happened. The gates of Alamut, which had remained closed to invaders for 166 years, swung open. Rukn al-Din walked out of the fortress, not as a king, but as a petitioner, kneeling in the snow before Hulagu Khan. The state that had held 3 empires hostage surrendered without a final bloody battle. It was an anticlimax that signalled the death of an era. The Mongols moved into the fortress with a cold, systematic efficiency. They weren't looking for gold or spices. They were looking for the heart of the Order's power. They began with the libraries. This was the cultural Chernobyl of the 13th century. Thousands of years of human thought, volumes on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and the secret histories of the Ismaili faith were dragged into the courtyards. Hulagu allowed the scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi to pick through the piles and save a few precious scientific works, but the rest were put to the torch. Eyewitnesses described the sky over the Alborz turning black with the soot of burning parchment. The collective memory of the assassins was being erased in real time. Once the books were gone, the walls followed. Hulagu ordered his soldiers to dismantle Alamut stone by stone. He didn't just want to occupy the castle. He wanted to ensure that no one could ever use it again. They used gunpowder, levers, and the sheer labour of thousands of captives to peel the fortress off the ridge. The granaries that could have fed the population for a decade were emptied. The sophisticated irrigation systems were smashed. By the time the Mongols were finished, the eagle's teaching was nothing more than a jagged pile of rubble, indistinguishable from the surrounding rock. The fate of Rukn al-Din Kersha was a brutal lesson in Mongol diplomacy. Hulagu initially treated him with a strange, mocking courtesy, taking him along on the campaign to help negotiate the surrender of the remaining 40 assassin fortresses. One by one, the mountain strongholds fell, some through fear, others through the direct command of their captured leader. When the last major castle had been cleared, Rukn al-Din had outlived his usefulness. He requested a meeting with the great Khan in Mongolia to plead for his people's survival. Halfway through the journey, near the Khangai Mountains, the Mongol guards led him away from the main road. He was beaten to death and his body was trampled into the mud by horses. The line of the Grand Masters of Alamut ended in a shallow unmarked grave. Back in Persia and Syria, the cleansing began. The Mongols issued an order to hunt down every person suspected of being an Ismaili. It was an organised genocide. Men, women and children were rounded up in the villages and executed in mass pits. The Fada'i, the legendary warriors who had once made sultans tremble, were hunted like animals through the very mountains they once ruled. Those who survived were forced to flee into the deepest shadows, hiding their identity, their faith, and their history. The fall of Alamut was more than a military defeat. It was the total collapse of a dream. If the state of scholars had been crushed by the state of iron, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief as the news spread from Baghdad to London. The Order of Assassins was dead. The masters of the hidden blade had been erased by the masters of the open plains, but history has a way of leaving behind embers, even after the greatest fires. In the ruins of the mountain forts and the whispers of the survivors, the spirit of the Order began its long, slow transformation into something the world would never expect. The smoke rising from the ruins of Alamut carried with it the scent of charred paper and the silence of a grave. To the Mongol generals and the Sunni chroniclers of the 13th century, the task was complete. They had dismantled the physical walls, burned the sacred texts, and executed the leadership. In their eyes, the Order of Assassins had been successfully deleted from the record of human affairs. They expected the survivors to scatter and wither away, eventually becoming nothing more than a footnote in the bloody history of the East. However, they made a fundamental mistake. They assumed that the Order was a place, when in reality it was a mindset. Survival in the wake of a genocide requires a specific kind of camouflage. The remaining Nizari Ismailis adopted the practice of taqiyya, a form of precautionary dissimulation. They stopped identifying as Ismailis. They traded their distinctive robes for the humble wool of Sufi mystics, or the everyday tunics of Sunni merchants. They lived in plain sight, praying in the mosques of their persecutors and keeping their true allegiances hidden in the deepest corners of their hearts. The shadow state had truly become a shadow. They moved east, following the ancient Silk Roads into the Indian subcontinent and the high plateaus of Central Asia. The dagger was buried, but the devotion remained as sharp as ever. Centuries passed, and the terrifying image of the assassin began to morph into something else. In the villages of Gujarat and the mountains of Tajikistan, the descendants of the Fadai evolved into a peaceful merchant-class community known as the Khojas. They shifted their focus from political assassination to communal survival and economic self-sufficiency. The line of the Imams, which the Mongols thought they had severed with the death of Rukn al-Din Kosha, had actually survived through a hidden lineage. In the 19th century, this lineage stepped back into the light of history when the 46th Imam, Aga Hassan Ali Shah, was granted the title of Aga Khan by the Shah of Persia. Today, the spiritual successor to Hassan-i Sabbah is the 49th Ismaili Imam, His Highness the Aga Khan. The contrast is one of history's greatest ironies. The organization that once specialized in the surgical removal of world leaders is now one of the most respected humanitarian agencies on earth. The Aga Khan Development Network builds hospitals instead of fortresses and funds world-class universities instead of training camps for killers. They are the global champions of pluralism and architecture, using the same intellectual rigor that once fueled the library of Alamut to solve modern problems of poverty and education. The legacy of the Order has come full circle, from a group that fought empires to a community that helped sustain the modern world. Yet, while the actual people have changed, the legend of the Order of Assassins remains frozen in time, a permanent fixture of our collective imagination. In 2007, a video game franchise called Assassin's Creed introduced the story of Masyaf and Alamut to a new generation. It blended the historical facts of the Crusades with a science fiction conspiracy, turning the Fada'i into hooded icons of freedom fighting against oppression. While the games take massive liberties with the truth, they captured the essential core of why the Order fascinates us. They represent the ultimate fantasy of the underdog, the idea that a single person with enough conviction and skill can challenge the weight of a corrupt world. The ruins of Alamut still stand today, though they are little more than weathered teeth of stone clinging to a ridge in northern Iran. Tourists now hike the same paths that the Fadari once walked in silence. Looking down from those heights, one can still feel the terrifying scale of the ambition that once lived there. Hassan-i Sabbah didn't just want to protect his people. He wanted to prove that the mind is a more powerful weapon than the sword. He showed that you don't need 1,000,000 soldiers to change the course of history. You just need to change the way people think about power. As we look back at this reign of terror and intellect, a haunting question remains. The Mongols had the iron, the Seljuks had the numbers, and the Crusaders had the faith, but all of them were eventually broken by time. The Order of Assassins, however, found a way to endure. They survived by becoming the very thing their enemies feared most, a ghost that cannot be caught. History tells us that empires are built on land, but legends are built on ideas, and while walls of stone will always crumble into the dust, an idea once planted in the mind is immortal. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the shadows of the Alborz Mountains. The story of the Assassins is a reminder that the truth is often far more complex and far more incredible than the myths we tell. If this exploration of the hidden corners of history has sparked your curiosity, please consider watching our next documentary on the rise of the Mongol Empire, where we explore the force that finally brought the eagle's nest to the ground. What do you think was the Order's greatest weapon? The dagger or the library? Let me know in the comments below. I'll see you in the next chapter of our shared past.